Welcome everyone to another Brain Fruits season episode for the season number 3, where we focus on how to engineer the future. I'm sitting in South Africa right now, and I have the pleasure to do another virtual streaming with a guest from the US. So we're here a bit in different time zones. But as you know, with Brain Fruits, we aim to give C-executive women leaders in tech and finance the insight, tools, and tactics to shape the future. You can listen to Brain Fruits on all major streaming platforms, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and Spotify. I'm your host, Hannah Becker, and it's a pleasure to introduce you today to Hilary Stevenson. She's an energy enthusiast with over a decade of experience and currently working as a senior advisor in the crude markets for Validere. She has over 200k followers on LinkedIn and loves to use clean data for a clear direction. Today, we're going to discuss strategies to achieve net zero, the key themes of our energy transition nowadays. Hilary, welcome to Brain Fruits.
Yeah, thanks, Hannah. Happy to be here. Happy Friday.
Happy Friday to you as well. It's great. I love to do these recordings on the end of the week. It just gives you another energy boost, I think. Can you tell us a little bit about your love for clean data and passion for crude markets?
Yeah, it sounds a little bit weird, but I'm kind of a data nerd. I got my undergraduate degree in chemistry with a minor in math. So while a lot of my peers were going off to pre-med, I started my career, but I had no idea that I was going to get into energy. But in my first job, I fell in love with refineries, which is kind of a weird thing to say. Not many people have a passion for refineries. But I was really fascinated about how refineries are essentially a huge chemistry experiment that just sort of like distill and rearrange hydrocarbons to extract like the most value out of crude oil and make all kinds of things that we use every day. So like a lot of people think about, oh, it's road fuels like gasoline, diesel, jet fuel. But refineries also make the building blocks for plastic and polyester used in clothing. It's really like a lot more than you might think. And the global crude market really runs on data, supply and demand data, price data, volume data, quality data. And my love for clean data stems from compiling data sets to analyze what's going on in the market. So early in my career, I spent a lot of time smashing together spreadsheets, only to find out at the end that the counts don't match or it fails a logic test. And then you got to go back and sort of like figure out like where that error was stemming from. So yeah, I love a clean data set, and I really appreciate all the hard work that goes into creating clean data. And especially when that data is driving something as important as energy and energy decisions. So like, we think about access to energy and cheap, affordable energy has really helped us to advance as society, enable technology and information sharing, and just really lets us lead better lives. So yeah, I'm passionate about crude markets and clean data sets.
I love the sound of clean data sets, especially when you tie it to decision making, something that I am personally also very, very passionate about. We all know we're not the best as humans to make data-driven and sometimes also risk-based decisions. So this is what we're going to focus on quite a bit today, also in our recording. But before we get into that, I just want to recap here a little bit on crude oil as a global commodity. Now there's this huge ask and huge shift towards finding alternative green energy sources, but still oil plays an important role in the global economy. It's the fundamental driver. I think you touched upon that a little bit as well, of oil prices, supply and demand. So this is where your love of data probably also comes in. The cost of extracting and producing oil is a really important factor that goes into that equation, of course. Oil demand itself is driven by everything from gasoline for cars and airline travel, as you mentioned, also goes into making plastic to even electrical generation. Crude markets, especially nowadays, seem to be asked to go on a diet in view of the energy transition. What's for lunch nowadays in the energy sector?
Yeah, no, I love this analogy because we talk a lot about like crude diets at refineries, and so it's a common sort of like market terminology. But if you think about it in terms of maybe like a 3-course lunch, the first course is a real focus on operational excellence and digitalization. So we may think about, extracting that crude oil or transporting it, or either even changing it at a refinery. There is more and more emphasis on doing that in a really efficient way. I just wrote a paper on sort of the ability for refineries to process more local crudes, and so it's sort of like a farm to table sort of thought, where we're really sort of like reducing those supply chains, making it a more circular economy, so that you can add more efficiency, which is really being spurred by the digitalization of the data that surrounds all of that. Then sort of the second course is fuels of the future. So you talked about like a lot of emphasis on renewable fuels and generating alternatives to maybe your petrochemical based feedstocks. And sure, we know that we can make renewable fuels from soybeans or corn, but there's a lot of risk in, are we just shifting an energy crisis to a food crisis? And it's really energy intensive to grow crops. You have to have diesel, a lot of times diesel powered farm equipment or petroleum based fertilizers. When we're thinking about the fuels of the future, people are also figuring out how to make road fuels from things like used cooking oil or animal tallow, biomass, and then there's even emerging technologies on how to create gasoline from carbon dioxide. I'm not sure how they're going to do that at scale.
I have not heard about that one at all.
Yeah, I think it's like a Microsoft-based company, 1.5, which is a really cute company name. But yeah, there's like, all kinds of different innovations on how to create the fuel of the future. And regardless of whatever feedstock it is, if we're using soybean oil or corn oil or animal fat, all of those feedstocks do still need to be refined and processed before they can just go straight into your gas tank or into your jet engine. So there will still be a need for part of the supply chain that exists, just shifting to potentially some additional and newer feedstocks. And then lastly, so third course meal, right? Like we have to have dessert. You can't have a good meal without dessert. So
Absolutely.
the last sort of like lunch item I would think about is the carbon markets. So as we talk about the energy transition, as we talk about net zero, essentially people are generating credits and buying credits. And that is a huge market and area for innovation. You have plant-based sequestration, which is like growing trees or planting hemp. You have direct air capture, which is just like collecting carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and condensing it and storing it, or even like sustainable farming practices that allow more carbon dioxide to be sequestered into the soil. So yeah, carbon markets is a huge emerging area that the industry is looking at.
Wow, I think other than if I would be, a 7-course type of gourmet person, this doesn't sound like a heavy diet to me at all, actually. So it sounds like there is a lot of potential and it's like a very tasty menu, I must say. I'm especially fond of the dessert when we talk about the carbon credits and also the trade of those. It's a very interesting market in itself. But before we go on to talk a bit more about the challenges to approaching the energy transition as a particular player in the carbon markets, I want to just highlight here that what you've said about the 3-course menu is actually also reflected in numbers, because we can see that the total value of that menu, so of global carbon markets, grew by over 20% in 2020 and 2021. So that's another consecutive year of record growth. And then you talked a little bit upon already what it means to be in a compliant carbon market. I also refer to it as CCM, I think. That's like all the markets where it's made mandatory by national, regional, or international regimes of trade. to regulate the carbon allowances. So this plays a really increasing visible role in efforts to reduce carbon emissions. I think that goes really well into the dessert conversation here. What is the biggest challenge to approaching the energy transition as a player in the carbon markets from your perspective?
The carbon market grew to a over $1 billion industry in 2021. And so like, who knows what will happen year in 2022, but it's a huge market. And it seems like everywhere you look, there's a green sticker or it's a net zero product. And most of the time, that means that carbon credits have been purchased in the voluntary market to make those claims. And it's really important that those credits that are generated are high quality and they're really doing what they say they're doing. So, in case you're not really educated in the carbon markets, a carbon credit is equal to removing 1 ton of carbon dioxide equivalent from the atmosphere. So you may be removing carbon dioxide, you may be removing nitrous oxide, methane, whatever the case may be. We just sort of normalize it to a ton of carbon dioxide equivalent. So convert it up to a CO2 molecule. 1 ton of that is 1 credit on the market. And we really think about high quality credits with 5 criteria. So those 5 criteria are additionality, measurability, permanence, avoid leakage, and verification. So when you think about, like, I can go into those a little bit. So like additionality means that like you weren't already doing it. So it has to be additional on a new initiative on top of your sort of business as normal in order to calculate that credit. I think about a good example is sustainable farming. Sustainable farming, you can sequester carbon into the soil by planting cover crops or doing no-till or low-till cropping. Well, if you were already doing that, then you can't claim that you're generating credits. I think both of those practices will sequester like 1/3 a ton a year an acre. So there is an opportunity to generate credits, but if you're already doing it, it's hard to baseline and measure. That sort of takes us into the second one, measure like what it was before, so you can measure how much additional carbon dioxide was captured. And then it also needs to be permanent. So we see a lot of like in the Inflation Reduction Act, we are incentivizing carbon storage. A lot of times that's underground in salt aquifers or in old oil and gas rigs. Well, we need to make sure that there's not going to be any leakage of that carbon dioxide sequestered. Or a good example is, a lot of people are familiar with planting trees to generate carbon credits. Well, like, what happens if that forest goes up in a forest fire? Then, like, now you've basically undone the permanence of the carbon that was sequestered in the tree in the first place. And then leakage, you might say, oh, well, Hillary, like leakage is the same thing as permanence, but it really is sort of thinking about what is the net, energy in order to sequester that carbon or remove that ton of CO2 equivalent from the atmosphere. So a good example is there's a lot of direct air capture. We talked about that earlier, technology on people figuring out how to, capture the CO2 from the air and then condense it. Well, a lot of times those processes are really energy intensive. And so if you're capturing the carbon dioxide and you're storing it, but the energy that you need to do that process is creating more emissions that you're removing in the first place, then that's not really helping. It's not net positive. A lot of times direct air capture, we've seen good examples using geothermal power. So that's a really good electricity source to run those kind of processes. You wouldn't probably want to do that if your electricity was from like a coal-powered power plant. So yeah, it's just good to look at your net sort of energy input when you're looking at carbon credit quality and verification.
I was not personally aware that the requirements to be able to have these type of carbon credits or to even be able to call it a carbon credit are that high. And Now, as an industry player in the carbon market, one of the things on top of my mind would probably be, how can I plan for tomorrow in light of this dynamic nature of the markets and the technology coming along, but also in view of quite complex requirements. You've talked a little bit in one of your articles about phases of energy transition, and I always like to first start with these type of questions to kind of see where we at the moment. Where did we come from? Where we at? In order to be able to say where we're coming. So this is your article, and I really loved it. I must say, I can really encourage everyone to read it. It really touches upon like the first phase, which is about awareness. It's a period where stakeholders are building alignment and what is actually important for the first phase. So like things like, should humanity make net zero a priority? Yes or no? How fast do we want to achieve it? What's the timeline? So it's really about like finding your OKRs, almost like the objective key results, right? And then it's
Yes.
all about like exploration. So this reminded me, I love it so much because it reminded me so much about what you would see in a product lifecycle. You know, you first have the exploration phase, the awareness phase, where you ask the question, what do we want to achieve? By when do we want to achieve it? Who are the stakeholders here? And then you go into discovery, or how you call it, exploration, which is a lot about goals. So for example, you want to have, I don't know, a reduction of emissions by, let's say, 1.5% or something. You then go into the exploration phase. So how can we get there? And then you go into execution, which is, I think, as the name kind of says, the final phase, where you have a clear mandate for change and you can take concrete steps to address them. Where are we at the moment? And how do I know, test, and implement the right transition strategy for my company in the phase that we're in right now?
Yeah, no, I love those three phases. The founder of my company, Dr. Ian Burgess, sort of like coined the phase zero, phase one, phase two that you just described. And I think for oil and gas specifically, we are definitely in sort of that exploration phase where everyone is sort of testing out like how do I do this? Can I make sure I get an ROI on my initiative? Is it at the end of the day actually reducing my emissions? Maybe I think that it's going to, and it doesn't as much as I thought. Or everything is always changing, and different methodologies and different reporting, different regulations are coming into play, and different monetary incentives to do different things. So it's definitely in the sort of like exploration phase, and I think we will once we see where the market really coalesces on like, okay, we have tested this, we've tried it out, then we can move into the execution phase and have a real, winner, and start to sort of deploy that at scale, and get some of the, maybe industry laggards on board with what we've, found to be successful. But like, if you like, that's for oil and gas, right? If you think about it generalized for like just a regular company, I can kind of like distill it down into some steps that we've seen work well in the oil and gas like exploration phase. So the first thing that you have to do is you have to take an inventory of all of your emission sources. The energy transition is all about reducing greenhouse gas emissions. We talked about CO2e. So in order for you to reduce them, you have to know what you have. And a lot of times it's really, people honestly don't know what they have in really, minute detail, like, oh, this building is running on heating oil, or this one is running on propane, or, oh, my assembly line is inefficient, and it produces these emissions. And so really going through and with a fine tooth comb, going through and making that inventory of all of your emission sources, that's the first step. Then once you know what you have, you can baseline and benchmark. And so you sort of like, okay, here's what I have. Now I can try different initiatives to try to reduce that. And I can also compare myself to my peers. Like maybe it turns out that, my inventory is like all, really very, very new. It has very low emissions, and I'm actually better than the person next to me, and my competitor. Then the key is to figure out how to reduce those emissions. So of course, once you figure out like, cool, here's my emissions total, you could just go out into the voluntary market and buy those credits to, negate out your emissions profile. But as we talked about, you want to make sure that you have a really high quality carbon credit if you're going to use that. But really, the name of the game is reducing emissions. And so if you can reduce your emissions from that initial baseline, the less credits you're going to need to buy, the better for the planet it's going to be for everyone. So, figuring out where you can reduce those emissions, maybe you can modernize your equipment, maybe you can reduce driving or, incentivize carpooling or public transit for your workforce. Any small step helps. Switching to greener electricity, or installing vapor recovery or sequestering carbon in some, manufacturing industries. Maybe that's not an option for everyone, but, really consider each thing and is it profitable to reduce emissions for each of those different spots. And I guess I'll give an example from oil and gas. So essentially companies are doing that, going through making their plan. And then we see in the news a lot about these like drone and satellite surveys that are flying over and sort of uncovering where all the sneaky emissions may be coming from. That is an excellent way to sort of check yourself every year. That's like your rinse and repeat reset. So I made a plan, I tried some initiatives, I get my annual survey and great, it's lower than it was last year. Or like, oh no, I did all these things and now it's higher. So kind of like back to the drawing board to figure out, new things to try and implement to sort of get that annual check lower and lower. It's kind of like when you go to the doctor, right? If you're sick, you may go to the doctor a lot, very often. And then hopefully, you are maintaining your health and then you just go every year for your sort of like annual checkup and make sure everything is running great.
And just to recap here, I mean, I think it's so vital to know about these steps because it's so actionable, as you say, taking inventory, going in whatever system you use, Excel, whatever, just noting down what areas you have of leakage or even of contribution, and then maybe prioritizing it towards what has the highest emissions and starting to figure out strategies to reduce that. Then always, of course, keeping yourself accountable, testing by what degree you have actually been successful to achieve your targets. So I really love these insights from your side. Now, you talk a lot about also in your papers that these type of reduction projects must be guided by facts and like having a top-down and bottom-up approach, both probably in leadership, but also when we talk about data. What are some of the myths that you can tell us about that make it much more difficult to actually implement or to actually even propose carbon reduction projects?
One great example is we saw this Stanford study where, and it compares to traditionally in oil and gas, how you report your emissions is based on emission factors. Like you just say, great, I have this equipment means this number, I add it up, I report it to the government, I carry on about my day. But that is literally just counting up numbers of things and not measuring what the reality is of those things at all. It does not account for unplanned events. It doesn't account for the forest fire or the major leak event. It's just a number associated with the things that you have. And when you compare that sort of like paper accounting approach to the Stanford study, which looked at that sort of like aerial flyover of total emissions. So if you take total paper emissions and you compare it to total detected emissions, the detected emissions were like 2 times higher. And not only was like the number different, but when you sort of like segregate, like, okay, well, where are these emissions coming from? Is it coming from flares? Is it coming from tanks? Is it coming from these things called pneumatic devices? Well, your paper accounting said, oh, it's these pneumatic devices. They are the bad apple. We really need to modernize and electrify those things, and that will really have a material impact. But when you look at the source from the Stanford study, it is actually tanks and volatile emissions coming out of storage tanks that constituted more of that pie than the pneumatic devices. And so, if you were just using that paper accounting, you might spend a lot of money to reduce your pneumatic devices, but really you should have spent your money on vapor recovery on your tanks. So it's a great example of where data can be misleading, and really we need to have like true measurement data to base our decisions on.
I think there's also a great call for action maybe to read that paper. So we'll try to put it in the show notes because it sounds like a super interesting study. Can you give us a few examples of successful companies or leaders having achieved to implement an energy transition initiative? And I think you've already touched a lot about what's the role of clean data, but maybe you can just recap on what that actually means in this context.
So two good examples. So we talked about reducing emissions. Is one of the options is sourcing greener electricity. So I think it was early in 2021 where Energy, which is a utility in Canada, wanted to source responsibly developed natural gas to feed their power plants and to provide their consumers with greener electricity. And they were able to partner with a gas producer, Pacific Cambrian, that is really like an industry leader in how to produce natural gas with really low emissions. They've gone through the steps and sort of proven that their emissions are really at the lower end, best in class. So that's one example where utility is buying directly gas that has been verified and certified as being low emission. And then on the crude side, Occidental is pairing their crude oil production with one of their carbon capture projects to essentially create a net zero crude. So they're already sort of matching up that credit and emissions and providing a product that has already sort of been zeroed out before it gets to the rest of the supply chain. So those are two specific examples, but then more broadly, we've seen participation in OGMP 2.0, which is alphabet soup. That's the Oil and Gas Methane Partnership. It's a UN initiative where companies like BP, Total, Equinor, and 80 more companies have agreed to participate in a reporting framework that provides accuracy and transparency into methane emissions data for oil and gas. And so it's really using measurement like we saw in the Stanford study to ensure that we have the best base case data, actionable and transparent data, so that we can get to reducing from reality. And that's really where data comes in, right? In order to verify or even calculate or measure emissions in the first place, companies have to collect and analyze massive amounts of data. And the cleaner the data, the better. Think about they're matching up their geospatial data with their quality and volume data, weather data. They have to convert units and convert time zones, and all of that, making sure that the source data is also really high quality and not prone to errors. So that's a big challenge, but it's great to see so many companies joining that initiative so that, we can sort of avoid some of the phase one energy transition risks, which is a risk of greenwashing. So, if the proof is in the pudding or the proof is in the numbers. So if you have the numbers to back it up, then it's a lot more defensible than just sort of broad claims.
And making this pudding, I have the greatest respect for this data engineering part, I think, because that is really can be quite hideous in some cases. You say matching up different data sources, spatial data, and then you also refer to different time zones. So it's quite a task to do. And then you have always this risk, of course, that if something is off, you will make your decisions based on data that was off. So we always want to ensure that the pudding is actually nice and clean and tastes good, I think, at the end.
Yeah.
Now, we talked a lot about the energy transition itself, the strategies to implement an energy transition, where we are as an industry when we talk about achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. What is been the biggest challenge for you personally to get stakeholders to care about the energy transition?
Yeah, so I think like kind of like two challenges. So the first, is in line with those three phases. A lot of people don't want to do experimentation. They just want to wait for the regulation. They're like, no, I don't want to waste my time figuring out what to do. I'll just wait for the government to tell me what to do. But really, in my opinion, the more industry participants we have involved in that experimentation, like that's how we're going to figure out what is the best solution and what's the most efficient market mechanism that we can probably have regulation emulate. So we need more participants to do more experiments and give their sort of feedback and input into what future regulations might look like, instead of just allowing governments to make that choice for the industry. And then the second, is kind of an unpopular opinion, but a lot of end consumers like to say, or like to think that like, oh, my individual contribution doesn't matter. It's really these big companies that are, that's where we can really move the needle. But the biggest portion of oil and gas emissions is not related to exploration or drilling or refining or any of that. It's the end use combustion in vehicles. And so I guess like cue Taylor Swift, like, it's me, hi, I'm the problem. I'm like, us driving our cars is the problem. And it's not just driving cars, like we need to put our money where our mouths is, buy that greener electricity if it's on offer to you, buy a hybrid. Even when I was Amazon shopping for Christmas, I could see the little like, oh, this ships local, or choose fewer packages. You can even, we talked about farming. You can participate in a community supported agriculture, which, is a smaller supply chain, more farm to table, reduces a lot of those transportation related emissions. So, like everything helps. And the more aware we are as consumers, and the more we incentivize big companies to, do those emission reduction initiatives, like the faster we're going to get to an energy transition.
I always like to say that people, when it comes to success, they like to do this, but when it comes to, oh, it's someone's fault, it must be someone outside, but definitely not me. So I like the reference to Tyler Swift. Oh, it's actually me. So get on your bike and start cycling instead of taking the car. I think this is a really great way to wrap up this podcast. And now we've heard about your success stories. You've shared amazing tools and tactics to start caring and implementing energy transition initiatives. What are some recommendations that you would have for our listeners who might be spearheading an energy transition project to get the company caring, but also to personally accelerate more towards net zero?
Yeah, like not to harp on it, but don't like be afraid to be a sustainability influencer. Like every small thing happen. Every small thing matters. You can ditch disposable cups. You can reduce your fast fashion. Like polyester is also a huge demand source for the petrochemical industry. And so if you're out there saying like down with big oil, but you're like wearing all fast fashion, like it's kind of like an oxymoron. Reduce your single-use plastics, like everything that we know. But you can also, I think we've talked a lot about data, and another effort you can take is to make sure that your company is really making decisions based on data and measurement data, and not just that sort of paper accounting of what you have. So measure and know what you have to make good decisions, and then be a leader and influence others to do their part as a consumer.
I like this narrative about being a sustainable influencer. I think that's the only influencer I would like to be personally. It sounds really, really important and gives a great sense of purpose, because you're actually helping us accelerate to achieve the sustainable development goals with things like fashion. So it's fun. And it's so easy when you talk about, disposable cups, so you don't have to work in the crude markets or be an analyst or expert analyst or whatever you are, but it's always about your individual choice as a consumer. Last question, where can listeners learn more about you and find you, Hillary?
Yeah. So I'm on LinkedIn, and you can also read that Three Phases blog and a lot more really great thought leadership from me and my team at my company website, valideer.com. There's a blog, there's webinars, there's lots of good information. So if you're interested in the energy transition, make sure to check it out.
I will personally do that again as well, just because I want my company to care much more about ESG risk. So I will go back to the Validaire website and check out some of the blogs. Thank you so much for being part of the podcast. It was a great pleasure to talk to you. I learned so much today about the crude markets.
Yeah, awesome, Hannah. It was great to meet you and great to chat today. Thanks for having me.